Welcome everyone. This PowerPoint is AP Environmental Science, Earth's Atmosphere. The learning objectives, we're going to focus on topic 4.4, which is Earth's atmosphere. The enduring understanding, Earth's systems interact, resulting in a state of balance over time. This is the same enduring understanding as the last one where we talked about tectonic plates. The learning objectives describe the structure and composition of the Earth's atmosphere. This is what we're going to stay with most of the time. And we'll talk about the essential knowledge at the end as usual. We're also going to touch on one other learning objective. This is topic 9.3, the greenhouse effect. And we're really just going to talk about this one, what the greenhouse effect is and what it results in. Vocab, as usual, I'm going to skip, but you can pause this video now and jot this all down. So let's start with the basics. What is the Earth's atmosphere? The Earth's atmosphere is composed of gases that are gravitationally bound to the Earth. So we all know that Earth has gravity. It's what allows us and everything on the surface of the Earth to remain on the surface of the Earth at all times, or at least most of the time. But the gases that make up the atmosphere are also gravitationally bound to the Earth. Okay. The atmosphere is important for many reasons. It creates pressure. This pressure allows water to exist as a liquid on the surface. Without that, water would just vaporize, liquid water would just vaporize, or we would just have ice because it also warms the Earth's surface. So without this warming effect, without the greenhouse effect, the Earth would be uninhabitable for life as we know it because we need that little bit of warmth that the greenhouse effect provides. A lot of ultraviolet light is absorbed by the atmosphere, especially the ozone layer, which we'll talk about. It reduces temperature extremes. Again, we'll talk about that, maybe not today, but on another day. Creates weather and climate variation around the planet. Provides us air to breathe. That's kind of important for us. But it also includes pollutants. So this is a negative impact also. So these pollutants can be natural in origin, such as coming from a volcano. It could be anthropogenic in origin, coming from human activity. In terms of composition, you guys do need to know the major gases in the atmosphere. You do need to know, and this is all by volume. The questions that I have seen are always by volume. It's not by mass or anything like that, but by volume. So 78% of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen gas, and that is two nitrogen molecules with a triple bond between them. 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen gas, and that is diatomic oxygen with a double bond. You guys do not need to know that almost 1% is argon. You definitely need to know that 0.041% is carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide, here's the molecular drawing. So one carbon double bonded with two oxygens on either side. There are other trace gases in the atmosphere. You do not need to know the percentage of helium or krypton or methane. You don't need to know any of those other trace gases, but those do include some pollutants. So we'll talk about some persistent pollutants in the atmosphere when we get to our pollution unit. That's also in the atmosphere and the air that we breathe. The variable one is water. Water is extremely variable. Water vapor is extremely variable in the atmosphere because of what it represents. It represents humidity or water vapor or really just humidity. In very, very humid areas like cloud forests, it could be just over 5% of the atmosphere. On the driest deserts in the planet, it could be less than 0.01% water vapor. So it's really based off of the location and the prevailing weather conditions. These three that I put stars next to are the ones that you guys need to know. And the numbers that I am underlining are the ones that you need to know. All right, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 0.041% carbon dioxide. All right, a little bit more information about those three. Nitrogen, diatomic nitrogen, extremely stable because of that triple bond. It's therefore inert to most living things. You breathe in, 78% of each breath that you breathe in is nitrogen gas. 78% of the gas that you breathe out is nitrogen gas. Your body does absolutely nothing with it. Plants can't use it. They cannot use it as a source of nitrogen. Animals can't use it. There's only some bacteria that we call nitrogen fixing bacteria that can take this nitrogen gas and use it for a form of energy. They can get energy from this, and they create other products. They create byproducts that plants can actually use for their nitrogen source. We'll talk about those a lot later in the semester. Okay, oxygen gas, definitely necessary for aerobic cellular respiration. You guys should remember that from CP Bio, and you should remember that it's a byproduct of photosynthesis. We will again talk about this a lot later when we talk about the carbon cycle, what photosynthesis is, what the reaction is, what respiration is, and what the reactions are. And then carbon dioxide, this is really important for two reasons. Necessary for photosynthesis, so for plant growth. It is also a greenhouse gas. So this is the first time in the course that we've talked about greenhouse gases and greenhouse effect. So what is that? So before we think about what the greenhouse effect is, I want to illustrate it using a thought experiment called black body radiation, or a black body thought experiment. Okay, so what I want you guys to imagine is a black box. You guys from art class know that black absorbs all wavelengths of light. So imagine that it is perfectly black hole black, that it's going to absorb all incoming light, everything from the visible spectrum as well as all of the other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, so we're talking X-rays all the way down to radio waves. All right, it absorbs all radiation coming into it. It's therefore going to absorb all of that energy and heat up, right? And imagine that its thermal properties are not affected by the material that it's made of. So like this steel bar, steel has certain thermal properties. That steel bar would have, that stuff that's made out of would have thermal properties. Imagine that this doesn't, that it has perfect thermal properties, that the material that's made of or the inside of it has nothing to do with heating it up. So as it heats, it's going to go through several stages. Okay. First, it's going to emit a little bit of ultraviolet light. That's what we're seeing right here. It's going to emit a little bit of ultraviolet light. You and I cannot see ultraviolet light, but some organisms can. Honeybees, for example, can see an ultraviolet, but we can't. But as this black box heats up, it will first emit some ultraviolet. It will then show some color. You'll start to get a little bit of color being visible as it heats. And at each stage of this, closer and closer to the heat source, or as it gets hotter and hotter, it goes from red to orange to yellow to white hot, right? And that's what we're seeing here. So we're first going to see it as a little bit of purple, and then into the blues, and then into the yellows and oranges, and then white hot. It's going to peak up here where it's showing all of the visible all of the wavelengths of the visible spectrum, and it's going to be white hot. Okay, so it's going to peak at white hot, and then imagine that you take the heat source away. The heat source could be the sun, could be anything else. Once the heat source is removed, it's going to cool back to dark. Okay, so it's going to go backwards through those stages. It's going to go white hot, down to oranges, down to reds, the cooler colors, and then eventually back to black. But none of us would touch the end of that bar because we know that it's still hot. Even though we can't see it, it's still emitting infrared radiation, and it's going to continue to emit infrared radiation for a very long time. Depending on what the peak temperature was, what the radiation intensity was, what the peak temperature is, it's going to emit heat for a very, very long time. Think of infrared as heat. Again, you and I cannot see in infrared, but some organisms can. A pit viper, for example, can detect infrared and, I'm putting quotes in my hands, see in infrared radiation, but we can't. But you would still know that it's hot. Okay, it's emitting that infrared radiation for a very long time afterwards. Okay, now why is this important? This thought experiment, which obviously those materials do not exist, but it's an analog for the Earth. The Earth is not a perfect black body. Obviously it is not. But there are a lot of surfaces on the Earth that do absorb a lot of wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, most of the wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum are either not energy intense enough, like radio waves and microwaves, for life to do much with, or the atmosphere or our magnetic field blocks them, like gamma rays, X-rays, and most of the ultraviolet. That's the reason that most of the light that hits the Earth is in the visible spectrum or down. Okay? Not super important for our class, but what is important is that there's a lot of surfaces on the Earth that do absorb heat. Everything from dark rock to, even light rock will absorb heat. Think about a sandy beach on a 100-degree day. You walk on that sand and it's going to burn your feet. If you go into the ocean, the water itself absorbs a lot of heat. So even though that the Earth is far from a perfect black body, there is still a lot of materials that absorb heat. Okay, the primary heat source for that is the sun, and that is what we call shortwave solar radiation. It's not as shortwave as gamma rays and X-rays, but it's in the ultraviolet to the shortwave of the it's in the ultraviolet to the visible spectrum. Okay, most of that is reaching the surface of the Earth, except for the parts that of the UV spectrum that get absorbed by the ozone layer, which we'll talk about later. Okay, most of the atmosphere is transparent to shortwave radiation, but except for that ultraviolet. Okay, so imagine that we have the Earth, it's sitting underneath the sun, and it's getting struck by all of this UVC, as well as mostly, some of this is getting absorbed by the ozone, but mostly the visible spectrum. Okay, things heat up on the surface, and then the sun goes down at night, and they're going to re-radiate that heat back out over a very long period of time. But because of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics and the fact that they're going to release it as longer wavelengths, they're going to release that energy as infrared. Okay, that's what we're going to feel as heat, and that's what we're going to call infrared heat or long wave radiation. So the Earth's surface is sitting under the sun all day. Imagine you have an asphalt basketball court or parking lot. That asphalt is going to absorb a lot of heat from the sun all day, and then it's going to re-radiate it out as thermal radiation or as long wave radiation or as infrared radiation. When I say those three things, long wave, thermal, or infrared radiation, even though they're not exactly the same, I'm going to use them more or less interchangeably. Okay, so the surfaces are going to re-radiate out that energy as infrared, but some gases can absorb infrared radiation. Those are what we call greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor are your main greenhouse gases, and they can absorb infrared radiation. So as the oceans or the land surface re-radiates out this heat, some of it is going to be absorbed by the gases in the atmosphere. This CO2 is going to absorb some of it, vibrate a little bit faster because it's a molecule and all molecules are always vibrating, but it's going to vibrate a little bit faster because it's absorbing this heat energy. And it's going to re-radiate out that heat in every direction. Some of it's going to escape out into space. Some of it's going to be absorbed by another greenhouse gas or another CO2 molecule. Some of it's going to go back down towards the surface of the Earth. And the atmosphere as a whole is going to stay warm because of that. Okay, so that's re-radiating it back down into the Earth's surface. Some of it is going to radiate up into space. Now imagine that you increase the concentration of CO2, increase the concentration of methane, increase the concentration of nitrous oxide, you are going to increase the greenhouse effect. And that once, I'm going to draw it up here because it's less busy up here, but imagine this is down in the atmosphere. This one CO2 molecule, as it absorbs some of this re-radiated heat from the Earth's surface, some of that infrared radiation, it's going to absorb it. Its double bonds are going to vibrate with more intensity, and it's going to re-radiate out that heat in every direction. Some of that is going to go out into space. Some of it's going to be absorbed by other greenhouse gas, other molecules of greenhouse gas nearby. Some of it's going to go back down to the Earth's surface and warm the Earth's surface. And that's what we experience as the greenhouse effect. Okay? Now you can think about this as a few different types of analogies. Some people talk about it as like a blanket over the Earth. Some people talk about it as like a literal greenhouse where you have a sheet of glass or several double-paned sheets of glass over a roof surface. Either way, it does the same thing. It traps this heat from escaping into space and re-radiates it back down to the Earth's surface or to other gases in the atmosphere that then absorb it, and you just keep that heat in longer. Okay, the same amount of solar radiation is striking the Earth's surface in both of these cases. It's just that increasing the greenhouse gas concentration is going to increase the greenhouse effect and have less heat go back into space because there's more of these molecules to absorb that heat than there were over on the left-hand side. Okay, and I should point out that the greenhouse effect is absolutely crucial for life as we know it to exist. Without the greenhouse effect, we would be a just block of ice, a giant ice cube floating through space. We would be a frozen planet. All right, so we would be what they call a snowball Earth. Now, a little bit of the greenhouse effect is great. Too much can be equally harmful. The last bullet point on the previous slide was about Venus. Venus has a runaway greenhouse effect, but it's not really a great analogy because that's not exactly how it works. Anyway, the principal greenhouse gases that we're going to talk about throughout the entire school year are going to be carbon dioxide, methane. Those are the really two important ones that we'll talk about a lot. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. However, we do not influence, although we are influencing the water cycle in many different ways, one thing that we're not contributing to is more water vapor in the atmosphere at any given time, because water vapor is really short-lived in the atmosphere and it just rains out, it precipitates out. So this one we're not going to worry about, even though it is a greenhouse gas. Now there is a couple times in the semester or in the school year when we will talk about water vapor as a greenhouse gas, but for most of the time we're going to talk about these two. And then nitrous oxide, this is also an important one, but one that we won't talk about as much. And then we have the fluorinated gases, a lot of, or at least a few representatives you see up here. And they are very potent greenhouse gases, but they are very, and they're very long-lived in some cases, such as a half-life of 3,200 years for sulfur hexafluoride. But they are not as large of a concentration as carbon dioxide and methane. And these two, again, are really the most important. Okay, especially for this class. Carbon dioxide, because this one is the most ubiquitous one, is going to be used as a benchmark, and we're going to set its global warming potential at 1. So how much can it warm the planet? Its global warming potential. We're going to set it at 1, and that's going to allow us to compare everything else to carbon dioxide. Everything has a lifetime in the atmosphere, so as it chemically reacts in the atmosphere to form different gases or different byproducts. Methane, for example, only has a lifespan of 12.4 years on average in the atmosphere. So over 20 years, it's going to have a larger greenhouse gas, a larger global warming potential than carbon dioxide by anywhere from 56 to 96 times. Depending on what study you're looking at. This is just pulled from YouTube, and you can go, or sorry, from Wikipedia, and you can check out their sources. But as it breaks down over the years, its global warming potential over 500 years is much less because it's not even there after 500 years because its life is only 12.4 years. Okay. So we're going to reference this several times throughout the year. Really not super important right now, but I did want to mention it because we are talking about the atmosphere. One of the main things about the atmosphere is the greenhouse effect, and that's one of the ways that we're changing the planet right now by releasing large amounts of these greenhouse gases. So I thought it was worthwhile talking about it. All right, back to the learning objective that we're really here for, the layers of the atmosphere, atmospheric composition, okay? The atmosphere is arranged in certain layers. Those layers are based off of temperature, the density of the gases in those layers, and the concentration of some of those gases. We really don't need to go into the specifics a lot. You guys do not need to know the thickness of each layer, but you do need to know the order. So starting down here at the bottom, the Earth is down here. The first one is the troposphere, and then the stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, and then finally the exosphere. Okay, so just following this diagram. So there's a couple of different relationships that we have measured that have to do with altitude. So as altitude increases or elevation increases, atmospheric pressure will decrease. So there's an inverse relationship there. And then as we increase in elevation again, the density is going to decrease. So this is showing 100% air density at sea level at 0. And then as you increase in altitude, density gets less and less and less. So there's an inverse relationship with both of these. As altitude increases, we have decreasing pressure and decreasing density. And this should make sense to you. Living in Denver, right, the Mile High City, we're roughly 50 to 80 feet above sea level, and pressure and density are both a lot lower here. So pressure, you may be interested in cooking or interested in baking, and you may have to modify your baking times or due to the altitude that we're at or the elevation that we're at here in Denver. Okay, but there's an inverse relationship between both of those. As you increase in altitude, pressure is going to decrease, density of the air is going to decrease. However, temperature is a lot more complex, and it has to do with the different gases that are in the atmosphere and where those different layers are. So as you're in the troposphere, as you increase in elevation or altitude, the temperature is going to decrease. So think about going from sea level in the tropics up, maybe think about the Himalayan mountains, right? You go from essentially sea level in Bangladesh or India, and then you start to go up in elevation as you move closer and closer to the Himalayas, and you get into the foothills, it's maybe a little bit cooler, and then you get up into the mountains themselves, and it's definitely a lot cooler, and then you get to the very top of those peaks, and you have glaciers even near, even in the tropics. Okay, so as you increase in altitude or elevation, temperature is going to decrease. But then once you hit this boundary between the troposphere and the stratosphere, you're going to have a switch in temperature. So temperature is actually going to increase as you go up in the stratosphere. Please note though that it never gets above 0 degrees Celsius, never gets above freezing in the stratosphere. The reason for this is that near the top of the stratosphere, we have the ozone layer. And ozone absorbs a lot of ultraviolet radiation, and that heats up the stratosphere. Okay, and then as you go up the mesosphere, it gets colder. That's actually the coldest layer is the mesosphere. So you might see an AP test question about what's the coldest layer. It is the mesosphere. And then you get into the thermosphere and the exosphere, and temperature is going to get extremely hot. All right. So let's talk about each layer a little bit. The troposphere. This is the one where you were going to live pretty much your entire life unless you are an astronaut. This is the layer closest to the Earth. It's where we are right now. It's where all weather occurs, or at least all weather for this class. Even on this diagram, you'll notice that the clouds, these large rain clouds, these cumulus clouds are going to top out, or cumulonimbus clouds are going to top out right at the tropopause, right at this boundary between the troposphere and the stratosphere. And you can see that classic anvil head shape where they are topping out. All right, so weather is going to occur down in the troposphere. When we're talking about atmospheric pollutants, most of them are going to be in the troposphere as well because they have greater density. Something like lead dust is going to be in the troposphere because it has greater density and is going to be closer to the Earth. It's going to be cooler as you increase with altitude or elevation, but there is an exception, and that exception is a temperature inversion. A temperature inversion is when a layer of cool air is going to get trapped beneath a layer of warm air. Say that you have a mountain valley, okay, these are mountains, and you have a city down in that valley, okay, so those are buildings in your city, okay. Say that you have cool air, which I'm going to show as blue right here, settling down in that mountain valley overnight, and then the sun rises, but the sun is blocked from getting into that valley by the mountains, and all of this air is going to warm. And even though warm air is supposed to sink, cool air is supposed to rise in this case, it's not going to because that cool air has become trapped beneath that layer of warm air. Okay, we'll talk about the importance of these a lot later in the school year, but I just wanted to mention it now because there is that one exception. Okay, this is going to contain the denser gases. The troposphere is going to contain the denser gases, right? Something again like lead that is a pollutant or atmospheric mercury that are very dense are going to be down in the troposphere. And it's where most clouds are because it's where most weather is, and it's where water vapor is. Okay. Okay. In the stratosphere, temperature is going to increase with altitude. Again, that's because we have the ozone layer up here, and that ozone layer is absorbing ultraviolet radiation. We'll talk about that on the next slide. You guys do not need to know the tropopause. That is not one of our vocab words, but you will see that these boundaries are named for the layer beneath them, and each of them end in pause. So it is pretty easy to remember them, though. Okay. There is a little bit of water in the stratosphere. There's going to be a small amount of clouds, very high clouds that are not rain-forming clouds, but very few clouds, very little water, but some. For this class, the most important thing about the stratosphere is the ozone layer. So in the mid to upper layers or mid to upper portions of it is the ozone layer. And the ozone just separates out based on density, and that's where it separates out to. Okay, ozone is going to absorb anywhere from 97 to 99% of medium frequency ultraviolet light. That's the ultraviolet light that is really carcinogenic. It mutates DNA. It's a mutagen, it's a carcinogen, and it is extremely harmful. So if we were to have that ozone layer go away, like we saw in the 1980s, that could be disastrous for life on Earth, especially the surface of the Earth, where that ultraviolet light would shine down and mutate DNA and make life on the surface of the Earth very, very difficult, if not impossible. Okay, we'll talk about why there was a hole in the ozone layer, or why at least there was a thinning of the ozone layer over Antarctica later on in the school year. Okay. The mesosphere, again, you might see a question about what's the coldest layer. It is the mesosphere, so that's really the most notable thing about it. Most meteors are going to burn up in this layer. It's where the air density is great enough to form that friction that's going to burn up those meteors, and that's really about it. And then we have the thermosphere. The thermosphere is named after the heat that is there. It gets very hot because it's the one closest to the sun, ionizing radiation from the sun, and it's absorbing a lot of those shortwave radiation like X-rays, at least the stuff that's not being deflected by our magnetic field. Okay, but the molecules are so far apart that you would freeze to death if you walked out of the International Space Station. Okay, so say that there's like a molecule of gas over here, maybe hydrogen, a molecule of hydrogen over there, and a molecule of hydrogen over there, and you have your little stick figure astronaut. The stick figure astronaut's going to freeze to death in the near vacuum that he's in because this molecule, even though it's racing by super, super fast because it's super hot, 1500 degrees Celsius, isn't going to strike him. Even if it did strike him, that's one tiny little molecule striking him, and it's not going to impart enough energy to keep this person warm. Okay, so you would freeze to death because the molecules are so spread out that they're not sufficiently able to transfer heat to you. Okay. The lower portion of the thermosphere and even some of the mesosphere contains the ionosphere. And that's not really that important for this class either, but that is where the auroras occur, so it is of note. Finally, the last layer is the exosphere. This is also extremely hot. It is sometimes considered part of the thermosphere, but a lot of people consider it separate. It doesn't really matter for this class. It's essentially the exit out into space, and there's no upper boundary because even if you are extremely far away, there is still a little bit of gravitational pull from the Earth to whatever gas is in space, and it's therefore a molecule of gas that's gravitationally bound to space, so it's still technically part of the atmosphere. All right, but really not super important for our class. All right, so one of the cool things about these layers is that you can literally see them if you are in the right position and the conditions are just right. So down here we have the troposphere, and in that troposphere you can see the tops of these clouds just topping out. Right, these clouds are just topping out right at the base of the stratosphere at that tropopause. And then you have the stratosphere above them. What I am guessing is this light blue color, and maybe the mesosphere above that. For this one's maybe a little bit more clear. You have the surface of the Earth. You have the troposphere. Again, you can see the clouds topping out right there at the troposphere. Then you have the stratosphere, you have the mesosphere, and then finally the thermosphere. And then again with this one, Earth down here, you have the troposphere, maybe the stratosphere, but I'm guessing that this is the stratosphere, mesosphere, and then the thermosphere. Okay, but these images really aren't super important except to be pretty pictures and to show that you can literally see these boundaries because the gases are different in each one. We don't have to get into all the technicalities there about what gases are where, but they do reflect light differently, so they're going to appear different colors. For these, just showing the auroras, so the aurora borealis or the aurora australis, depending on whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere respectively, and it's from ionizing radiation from the sun striking the Earth's atmosphere and exciting the gases that are there and making them shine in pretty colors. Again, not important for our class, but they are pretty pictures and definitely relevant. All right, so just returning to these learning objectives, the essential knowledge. The atmosphere is made up of major gases, again, the ones that you need to know, N2, O2, CO2. We'll talk about pollutants and other trace gases later on in the school year, but these are the major ones that you need to know, and you definitely need to know those concentrations of those. And we talked about the layers of the atmosphere, the temperature gradients that are included in those as well. Okay. Over here, we just barely talked about the greenhouse effect, essentially what it is, what it does, and some of the major players involved.